open up to Hebrews chapter 4. We'll go ahead and get started with our class this morning. That's Hebrews chapter 4. Today is class number 8 in our study through the Epistle to the Hebrews. And in this class, we're going to finally be returning back to the text of the book of Hebrews after our brief detour last week. In that class, we focused on the historical tradition of biblical priesthood, mostly looking at the Aaronic priesthood and then some emphasis on the priest outside of the Levitical priesthood. Now, as way of review, we started last week's class discussing the events at Mount Sinai and the priestly tradition that God delivered as part of that revelation at Sinai. That included the Levites, the children of Aaron, who were going to serve as priests, and then Aaron himself, who was the singular high priest of Israel. And we briefly talked about how that revelation of the priest was part of a larger set of instructions that God had given to the Israelites. What was that larger set of instructions of which priests were just a part? There was the law as a whole, that's right. And what takes up the bulk of the law? What set of instructions? Not the Ten Commandments, no. Those are going to be more moral and with the civil nature of the people.
Sacrifices.
Yes, the sacrifices, the tabernacle is how we express it. So it'll be the materials for the tabernacle, the instructions about how to build it, then the operations within the tabernacle. And as part of those operations, you have the priest. The priests are just one part of the facilities and the rituals of the tabernacle. And what was the ultimate purpose of the tabernacle? It was so God may dwell with his people. Now, unfortunately, that cohabitation of God with man is not an easy task. There's a large gap between the holiness of God and then the unrighteousness of man. And to help bridge that gap, God gives his people mediators. He gives them Levites, priests, and a high priest. Now, last week we discussed several of the functions. We had 6 of them. 6 functions that priests serve in order to bridge that gap between people and their God. Can anyone remember any of those 6 functions for me? So they had to teach the people. That is correct. Yes. Yes. Okay. So first they did teach the people. They taught holiness to the people with the goal of making the people holy enough to come near God themselves. They had to make the congregation righteous enough that God may dwell in their presence. And you remember who we said they represent in this function? Who the priests are standing in the place of when they teach the people? Sorry? Standing in the place of God. That is correct. The priests represent God to the people. They speak the words of the Lord. They represent the holiness of the Lord. And they attempt to draw the people into closer communion with the Lord. What else do the priests of the Old Testament do? That's 3 functions. 3 more. Sorry? They provide aid. I'm going to count that as the drawing people near or trying to make them closer to God. They also face the other direction, where priests represent common people, their nation, before the Lord. And we stated here that there were a couple of prerequisites to that step. Priests were supposed to be holy. Above everyone else, they had cleanliness laws, wardrobes, all sorts of regulations to make sure they were holy so that they could go before God. They could come closer, geographically, physically closer to the presence of God than any of the people. And they brought the people's offerings with them, their intentions, their prayers. They were a substitute that came before the Lord for all the people. So priests represent a bridge that carries traffic both ways. They represent God to the people and the people before God. Now, in the final third of last week's class, we then kind of shifted gears. Instead of talking about the priest at Sinai, we talked about the priest which predated Sinai and some of the people who performed priestly activities after the revelation of Sinai and the start of the Levitical priesthood. Who were some of these non-Levites who operate as priests or perform priestly activities in the Old Testament? Okay, So we know of Job performing sacrifices and prayers for people. Moses does the same. He ordains other priests, and then he also intercedes for them. Who else? Melchizedek is, of course, the first one. He'll be of a lot of importance to us in a couple of weeks. David was one as well who does all sorts of things that are very priestly activities. Sorry? Samuel, that's correct. Samuel operates as a priest, and then David's son, Solomon, as well. These characters, although they're not descended from Aaron, they perform very similar functions to the Levitical priest, and they're also highlighted as being holy, near to God, and they represent the people before the Lord, and they typically also teach holiness to the people and bring others near to God and represent God to the people. And so we closed last week's class by discussing how all of these various capacities carried out both by Levitical priests and non-Levitical priests typically cross some boundaries in what we call Old Testament biblical roles. They operate as prophets, they operate as priests, and sometimes they also operate as kings. And all of this, of course, is foreshadowing of the Son of Christ. Christ is the pinnacle of the prophets. We discussed that in chapters 1 and 2 of Hebrews. He is the ultimate revelation of God. Christ is the pinnacle of all kings. We again discussed that in chapters 1 and 2. He is the ultimate authority of God. And as we'll start to examine in today's class, Christ is the pinnacle of all priests. He is the ultimate mediator of God. So in today's class, we're going to finally get into the central argument of the book of Hebrews, and the author is finally going to lay out his main premise in full clarity. And this explanation or this argument is extensive. It's going to start here at the end of chapter 4, and it's going to go till nearly the end of chapter 10. So we have 6 whole chapters, which are going to be focused on the central argument of Christ's priesthood. So let's start into our new material today in chapter 4, near the end, in verse 14, where the author finally presents the grand purpose of this letter. So Hebrews 4:14. Since then, we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. These 3 verses summarize and contain the whole purpose of the book. Verse 14 in particular lays out the primary assertion. We have a great high priest, Jesus, the Son of God. And as a result of this, we must hold fast our confession. Now, I do want to briefly note here, this assertion of verse 14 is as of yet unproven. This is something that has not been substantiated up to this point. In this class, we have repeatedly emphasized the priesthood of Christ, and the author, so far in Hebrews, has not given any proofs to this. He has not substantiated it in any way, and it really hasn't received much emphasis before this point. And I bring this up to point out just a couple of things. First, to my frustration, the author does not present his argument in the order that I would like. He doesn't start with these small principles and then slowly add to it, building up to his grand conclusion. Instead, he begins with the large dramatic statement before he will progress to making all of his supporting statements, which build off of that central argument. So we're getting that large, grand statement now here at the start of his central argument. And this shows us something, perhaps, about the original recipients of Hebrews. The author seems to expect some surprise or apprehension about this statement. Now, in our modern day, Christianity's been around a long time, and most of us have probably heard that Christ is prophet, priest, and king over and over again throughout much of our life. So perhaps we don't question that, and we don't wonder about how can he be a priest. But to the audience, the original audience of Hebrews, the author seems to expect that he must defend his claim. He must explain all of the results and the reasons why he would make such a dramatic claim. So as we go through the next 6 chapters, I encourage you all, let's not take it for granted that Jesus is prophet, king, and priest. We would do well to mentally labor through the same arguments that the author expects his original audience to labor through. And what is the fruit of that labor? What is the application that should come out of our working to understand Christ as priest? He says it in verse 14. What's the result? So that we may hold fast our confession. Now, this isn't the first time that we've talked about our confession in the book of Hebrews. You can look back to chapter 3 and verse 1, where the author tells them to meditate on, consider Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession. What does that mean? What is a confession, specifically in the context here of Hebrews? Okay, so confession is our faith, that's right. There's a bit more nuance to it, but faith is certainly the central part of the confession here in Hebrews. A confession is a proclamation of faith, that's right. There's an interior aspect of confession, which is hope and faith or belief, and there's an exterior aspect of confession as well, by which we proclaim our faith by words or by deeds, perhaps. So why is this public idea of confession so important here in the book of Hebrews? Why would that matter to the author and to his audience? Okay, so they're struggling, and so he just wants to encourage them as well to keep pressing on in the way they should behave. Why is the public nature of their behavior of importance? They're representing Christ, that is true. How is the public treating them? They were in the midst or expecting persecution very soon. And therefore, the author doesn't just encourage them to behave themselves inwardly or to be quietly a Christian. He says that they must keep their confession of the faith and therefore remain steadfast in that confession. And this allows us to add a little nuance to what we have expressed over and over again is the primary purpose of the book of Hebrews. What is that reason? What was the author trying to accomplish when he wrote the book of Hebrews? He wanted Christians to persevere through persecution. And now we can get a little more specific and say it is particularly public perseverance that is encouraged during persecution. During the very time where perseverance would be most tempted to turn inward and quiet and silent is exactly when the author says, no, it must be a confession. It must be something which is still proclaimed to the world. Now, this public nature of the Christian confession is going to be important over the next, really 2 chapters. But in chapter 6 and near the end of chapter 5, we're going to see it contrasted with Christians professing or confessing things other than Christ. So there is a public nature that we're supposed to understand here. And this is what Christ encourages us in. This is what Christ enables us to remain steadfast in. Now, verse 15, moving on, kind of changes to offer us a brief but a rather powerful explanation of how Jesus' priesthood results in Christian steadfastness. Our high priest is able to sympathize with our weaknesses, having been tested in every respect like us. Now, that should be ringing some bells in your head. What does that remind you of that we've already studied? Back in chapter 2, you can turn back there. We'll read this together. In Hebrews chapter 2, starting in verse 10, we covered a very similar concept. I'll start reading there in Hebrews 2:10. For it was fitting that he, for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering. For he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one source. This is why he's not ashamed to call them brothers, saying, I will tell of your name to my brothers. In the midst of the congregation, I will sing your praise. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, behold, I and the children God has given me. Since, therefore, the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is, the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. For surely it is not angels that he helps, but he helps the offspring of Abraham. Therefore, he had to be made like his brothers in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For because he himself has suffered when tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. It is in the incarnation that the Son of God, that God the Son, has become man, and he has been tempted in every way. And how is that temptation described there at the end of chapter 2? It is suffering. That's right. Jesus has suffered as he has been tempted. As part of his humanity, Jesus has shared in the universal human experience of temptation and suffering. And these two concepts should not be viewed as parallel or separate. In Hebrews, temptation, testing, trials, and suffering are nearly synonymous terms. And you can imagine how those would be synonymous if your temptation or your trial was persecution. Suffering is part of the human experience of being tempted. And we are told in Hebrews 2 that because Jesus has suffered like us, been tested like us, he is able to relate to us as brothers and sisters. He is able to provide us help. But back in Hebrews chapter 4, in verse 15, there's something unique about Jesus' humanity. What is that? What is unique about Jesus' experience with suffering and temptation? He did it all. He suffered and was tempted without sinning. Unlike the rest of his brothers and sisters, only Jesus knows the ways of victory. Only he knows what it means to face trials without defeat. And so in a very real way, Jesus is also not like us. He is better than us. He supersedes all of his brothers and sisters. Yes. Well, we'll get to the priest in just a second. You're all right. You're on the right track. You're just 10 minutes ahead of me right now. But yes, that's exactly where we're heading. But first I want to pause for a second and talk about this mental comparison between humans and God the Son. We mentioned at the start, there's this great gap between the children of Israel and the Lord who comes to dwell among them. And this gap kind of reappears here in Hebrews chapter 4. This mental comparison between Christ and ourselves sometimes leads to undesirable results. What are some of the reactions that might occur within you when you consider your sinful nature, your failure to persist through trials and temptations, as compared to Christ's perfection in trials and temptations? What feelings does that bring inside of you? Okay, perhaps discouragement. That's a good one. Okay. Okay. Yes, so we're told in Hebrews 2 that Christ isn't ashamed to call us brothers and sisters. But I think when we think of the difference between us and Christ, shame is probably pretty high on the list of feelings there. I also put humility. We should be humbled by recognizing the difference between our reaction to some temptations versus Christ's reaction to temptations. And perhaps there's some fear as well, as we talked about through a good chunk of chapter 3 and chapter 4. And I want to lead off by saying most of these reactions are at least appropriate, they're natural, and some of them are perhaps even good, and yet they can all be taken too far. When we allow our shame or our fear or our humility, as our meditations between us and Christ, to turn into mistrust, to turn into discouragement, or to turn into distance, then we have crossed the line. But that's often what those things turn into. We recognize the great differences between us and Jesus, and we seek to distance ourselves even further. Maybe that seems odd, but really it is an act of prideful independence to where we think, well, I'm not like the Lord, and therefore I will place myself apart from the Lord. And perhaps we think we're doing it to protect him, or we think we're doing it to protect ourselves. But our reaction to the perfection of Christ should not be separation, distance, hiding from him, or fleeing from him. It must instead result in complete and honest dependence. We should stay even closer to the one who is far above us, even closer to the one who could judge us, even closer to the one who is perfect. And this is what we're told in verse 16. We must not run from Christ. Instead, Christians are commanded to approach the throne of grace. Now, what is the throne of grace? What does that mean, or what is that imagery pointing to? Okay, so there's God, yes, so we are approaching God in some way. Okay, so God's presence. Okay, thrones usually have a judgmental aspect, that's right. Mercy seat is where I'm going with this. We're thinking of the tabernacle again, where God has come to sit and dwell among mankind. That's right. So we have a throne on earth. Yes. What is the mercy seat modeled after? That's right. Through several of the prophets, and even later on in Hebrews, we see that there's a heavenly throne room in which God sits and is surrounded by adoring cherubim. So we have the mercy seat in the Old Testament tabernacle, the heavenly throne. Where else have we seen throne imagery pop up already in our study? Over and over again, especially in chapter 1, Christ is the one who is portrayed as enthroned in heaven. He is the one who is seated. That's correct. I think it's in 1 verses 3, 8, and 13. He has passed through the heavens. He has taken his seat beside the Lord. So to come before the throne of grace is to enter the heavenly most holy place, to come before the heavenly mercy seat, and to be in the presence of the enthroned and incarnate Son. And how are we supposed to make this incredible approach? My text says boldly, but I like with confidence much more. I have tended to hear boldly receive the most attention as it dramatically presents our approach to Christ on his throne, but I do believe the more subdued tone is correct. The same word is used back in Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 6, and there pretty much every translation will define it there as holding fast to our confidence. We do not come before Christ in a brash manner or a domineering fashion, but with assurance, with confidence. And what is it that we are sure of? What are we confident in when we come before the throne? Okay, so he will be receptive. He will be faithful to do what? That's right. If we continue in verse 16, it says, we are confident that we may receive mercy and grace. Catch up on my PowerPoint there. This is the help or the aid that we just read about in Hebrews 2:18. He became man so that he could be our high priest and offer help to those in need. Now that aid or that help is further defined as being mercy and grace. So what is mercy? How does that fit into this context? Okay, something you don't deserve. That is true. Mercy is usually contrasted with justice. I have it as typically a negation. You don't receive what you ought to, and that lack of receipt is to your benefit. But we also receive grace. What is distinct about grace from mercy in this context? Mm-hmm. Yep, they're not. What about with mercy, though? How does grace compare with or contrast with mercy here? I tend to think of grace as an addition. It's not always used that way through Scripture, but I believe here we're supposed to read these two as layering together. You receive more than you ought to. and this also is to your benefit. So I'd encourage you to see mercy and grace here as the fruits of those two Christian motivations that we talked about through chapter 3 and chapter 4. Christians should be motivated by fear of God's justice, and yet we still approach his throne confident in his mercy. Christians should be motivated by hope of God's reward, and we approach the throne with confidence in his grace to provide us even more than we had hoped for. And when is this combination of mercy and grace made most available to Christians? It's during our time of need. We should be confident that exactly when we most need the help of the Son, that is exactly when Christ is most excited, most willing to provide us with mercy and grace. In what capacity does Jesus provide this mercy and grace? We can't forget this. This is the overarching theme. How is he acting, and what role is he acting when he provides us mercy and grace? He is our mediator. He is our priest. He's on the throne, yes. It's the same Christ who is our mediator and the enthroned Lord. He is both the priest and the king. But it is his role as priest that allows us to confidently approach the throne. And let's notice the author's logic here before we move on. Christ's role as priest allows us to also come before the throne of mercy. He's again making that connection a bit more clear to the Old Testament priest. Only the high priest was allowed to pass through the tabernacle, to come to the most holy place, and to sit before the mercy seat of God, or to make offerings before the mercy seat of God. And now Jesus has passed through the heavens in order to go to the heavenly most holy place, where he represents his people, and he offers our prayers. He acts on our behalf for our benefit, achieving for us mercy and grace. Christ is there to represent his people and to help his people. Now, in the following verses, this contrast or this comparison of Christ's work in the heavens with the priest of the Old Testament is going to start to get unfolded and explained in greater detail. As I mentioned at the start, this is going to go on for 6 chapters. So we're going to repeat some themes several times. And there's also going to be a few occasions where you think, I want more details on that. And maybe you'll eventually get them, but it might be 3 chapters from now. So we'll try and just stick with what he has written here at the time being, and we'll return to some of these ideas in greater detail in future classes. So let's press on to chapter 5 now and discuss the Aaronic priesthood, or the imperfect priest. Chapter 5, verse 1. For every high priest is chosen from among men, is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. Because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people. And no one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was. Now, these verses won't present any new information to someone who is already familiar with the Old Testament priesthood and the originations of that priesthood. Instead, the author is just bringing up certain facets of that tradition that he wants to compare with Christ in the next 5 verses. And these facets are ordered into 4 levels. It'll be the purpose of the Old Testament priesthood, the sympathy that they had with their congregation, the offerings which they made, and then their calling, or the way they became priests originally. Now, last week we already spoke extensively about the larger purpose and the larger gifts that were offered by priests on behalf of their people. And the author summarizes all of those ideas, those various functions, into a short statement. A priest is appointed to act on behalf of others before God, offering gifts and sacrifices. But we should notice here that in this text there's a particular emphasis on the forgiveness of sins, which is accomplished by the priest's actions on behalf of others. Both the priest and the sacrificed animal, the offering, they both stand as substitutes. They both stand as substitutes for the men and women who enjoy the fruits of their labor. And therefore, in order to operate as an effective mediator or an effective substitute, the priest must be like those who they are representing. And this likeness allows the priest to be gentle with the ignorant and the wayward. Where have we heard this phrase before? Where has ignorance and waywardness already popped up in Hebrews? Back in chapter 3 and verse 10, when the author is quoting the words of the Spirit from Psalm 95, he states there that the sin of that generation which has provoked the Lord is they always go astray in their heart. They have not known my ways. This is the sin of the Exodus generation. They persistently did not know the Lord's ways. They remained ignorant, and therefore they strayed. They were wayward in their hearts, and then they were wayward in their feet soon after. This is what caused that Exodus generation to fail at Kadesh Barnea. Now, the irony is that priests are specifically designed to help people during these kinds of times of need, these kind of testings, sufferings, temptations, or trials. And what gives the priest the ability to deal gently with people during these kinds of trials? They also face these same trials. They also have to face ignorance. They have to face waywardness in their own hearts. Now, unfortunately, how did the Levitical priest fare against their own trials and temptations? Like their flock, they too sin and fail. And because of their own failures, the priest cannot just solely make offerings for other people, for other people's benefits. They're required to make offerings for themselves. And notice how that conflicts with and distracts from the purpose as it was stated back in verse 1. Priests are supposed to operate on the behalf of others. They're supposed to make offerings for others in their sins. But these priests can't do that all the time because they're busy making offerings for themselves, distracted from their true purpose. Yes, because of their imperfections, they too need forgiveness for their own ignorance and their own waywardness. Now, despite their sins and their imperfections, the Old Testament priests are still wildly important figures in the salvation of others. And how is it that they gain this all-important role? They must be called. That is correct. In Exodus 28, Aaron is specifically selected by God there as the high priest of his people. Was every high priest in the Old Testament selected by God? According to Hebrews, yes. Every single high priest is called by God. Every single one of them. Now, it's a bit of a trick question because not each one was called miraculously. Not each one had a voice spoken from Mount Sinai calling them up to serve as the high priest. But every high priest is selected by God. I'd encourage you to maybe think of this similar to God's selection of the rulers of the earth. I don't think he miraculously appoints every president, senator, king, or leader, but that doesn't make the authority that he gives them any less real. God still selects, chooses, and gives real divine authority to the priests who represent their nation as a substitute or a mediator. But there's one additional phrase that's included here in Hebrews chapter 5. The author states, no one takes this honor for himself. Why does he say that? Why did this need to be stated? Okay. Yes, so because other people at times have tried to take on the priesthood. Andy? Okay, yeah. The source of the authority is that it comes from God. Sorry? Because Christ is the same. Yes, we'll get to that in just a second. I want to first emphasize there's a lot of questions about who the priest is at this time in history. We read about this a little bit in Scripture, but you can find it all over the place in other documents from the time. A lot of questions regarding the legitimacy of different priests who claim to be the descendant of Aaron. The Sadducees in Jerusalem, remember that they had their own priests that they backed of the Hasmonean dynasty. So that would have come about during the Maccabean revolts, okay? The Essenes, who got out of Jerusalem, they would not recognize the city, they would not recognize their temple, they would not recognize their priest. They backed their own family of priests, the Zadokites, who they said came from the times of David and Solomon. Different sects within Judaism of the day all backed their own priests and had different ideas about who were the legitimate priests. And this became a religious question, but also a political question once Rome gets involved. But you could largely prove it by whether or not a Roman governor backed you and how many people were on your side. But yes, there was usually some attempt made at like proving your lineage. But there's a lot of people who descend from Aaron by this point in history. And so the question is, who should be the actual rulers? And that tends to get made by might. But what the author is trying to confirm here is that only one thing makes someone a legitimate high priest of God. And that's being called to the job by God himself, just like Aaron was. And this now leads the author to talk about Jesus once again. Now we're going to walk through the same 4 facets of priesthood, but now we're going to do it in a reverse order, starting with calling. So let's begin now reading in Hebrews chapter 5, verse 5. So also Christ did not exalt himself to be high priest, but was appointed by him who said to him, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." As he says also in another place, "You are priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek." In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. These verses begin by addressing the big question: when was Jesus called to be the high priest of God? Or to phrase it another way, is the supposed or claimed priesthood of Jesus legitimate? And to answer these questions, the author utilizes his old habit of taking us to the Psalms. And these Psalms aren't just metaphorical poetry. He says they are a real conversation that happens between God the Father and God the Son. So let's go ahead and turn to Psalm 2 and start to examine the author's proofs of the legitimate priesthood of Christ. Psalm 2. So Psalm 2 is a messianic psalm. It specifically talks about God's anointed one, and part of the psalm is God himself addressing his anointed one, his Messiah. And starting in verse 7, it reads, "I will tell of the decree. The Lord says to me, the anointed one, 'You are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel.'" As Messiah, the Son here in Psalm 2 is described as possessing all the nations of the earth, and he has his scepter in his hand, a rod of iron, dashing his enemies to pieces. And since the author is writing to those within the Christian community, he has an assumption that they will all be on the same page. Who is Psalm 2 about? It's about Jesus. It's about Christ. Yes, Jesus the Messiah. He's writing to people who already accept Jesus as their Messiah, and therefore when they read Psalm 2 as a messianic psalm regarding the anointed one, they recognize he is a king. He has this rod from the Lord. He rules over the nations of the earth. But Psalm 2 is not the only appearance of the Messiah in the Psalms, especially ruling in a similar fashion. Let's turn over to Psalm 110 now. Psalm 110. Here we read a very similar description. Starting in verse 1, "The Lord says to my Lord, 'Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool.' The Lord sends forth from Zion your mighty scepter. Rule in the midst of your enemies. Your people will offer themselves freely on the day of your power, and holy garments from the womb of the morning. The dew of your youth will be yours. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. The Lord is at your right hand. He will shatter kings on the day of his wrath. He will execute judgment among the nations, filling them with corpses. He will shatter chiefs over the wide earth. He will drink from the brook by the way. Therefore, he will lift up his head. Psalm 110 is also about the Messiah who has this scepter and the shattering power of God over his enemies on the earth. The similarities between these two Psalms, Psalm 2 and Psalm 110, are even more explicit in the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, which translates verse 3 as, with your dominion in the day of your power and the splendor of your saints, I have begotten you from the womb before the morning. The author expects his audience to know the similarities between these two psalms, to recognize how similar they are, close they are to one another, and to come to a singular conclusion. The ruling Messiah of Psalm 2 is the same person as the ruling Messiah of Psalm 110. These are not two separate individuals. They both are talking about Christ. Now, back in chapter 1 of Hebrews, Psalm 2 was used to describe the Son's or Christ's specific role as the Son of God, the one begotten by God. In Psalm 110, what special title is given to the Messiah? There in verse 4, he is described as priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. By connecting these psalms, which the first century church read all about Christ, the author shows that Jesus is Messiah, which means he's also Son of God, which means he's also a priest of God. God himself in Psalm 110 has called his Son to serve as the people's high priest. Now, this calling to priesthood is going to be examined in greater detail in chapter 7, and so we won't make any more application but this. Jesus is a legitimate high priest. We can read in Psalm 110 that he was divinely called just as Aaron was. And since Jesus is divinely called to be our high priest, he must go about doing priestly duties, meaning he must make offerings on behalf of his flock. What kind of offerings does Jesus make back in Hebrews chapter 5? In Hebrews chapter 5, Jesus is described as making certain offerings in verse 7. What were those? It's prayers and supplications. Unlike the flesh and blood of animals that the Old Testament priest offered, Jesus offers prayers and supplications. What descriptors are used to elaborate on these prayers and supplications? They're loud crying and tears. What is that also connected to in verse 8? Suffering again, that's right. How else are these prayers and supplications made? They're made to God, and before they're described, or before they're named, what's the first description of them? They were made in the days of his flesh. Don't let that slip past you. It is during his incarnation that Jesus starts to make offerings for his people. He doesn't just behave as priest in heaven. During the days of his flesh, he was already making offerings of prayers and supplications. Any examples come to mind for you of when in his flesh Jesus made offerings of prayers and supplications as a priest? Okay, John 17, right? The high priestly prayer, that's a good one, when he's heading to the garden. I have in the garden as well. There in Gethsemane, we know that he made suffering prayers. I think most likely what the author is trying to get at here is the prayers of Jesus from the cross itself, where he cries out, praying for the people who are surrounding him. It seems that the author is trying to direct our minds to the end of Jesus' life, the crucifixion. And this has significance. Obviously, this is where we attain our salvation, but to the original audience, this was also the epitome of someone facing trials, temptations, sufferings, and persecutions. And their high priest went through all of that, not having to focus on himself. He didn't have to make offerings for himself. He was able to focus on others and to finally serve perfectly as a high priest is supposed to. And this priestly purpose is highlighted again in verse 9. Or actually, we're skipping a section here, but we just don't have time. Mm-hmm. Jesus becomes the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. And notice how this also contrasts with the description of the priest back in verse 1. The priests of Israel had to make offerings of animals, gifts, and sacrifices to the Lord in order to accomplish forgiveness for their people. They were a crucial component of the forgiveness, but Jesus is far more than that. He is not just a component in the mechanism of forgiveness of his people. He is the source. And this forgiveness is not temporary. It's not something that needs to be repeated with many offerings. It is something which is eternal. And we'll return to these concepts in later classes, but obviously, the forgiveness which comes from the Son is far superior to anything accomplished by the old Aaronic priest. And this is fitting because Jesus isn't an Aaronic priest. He's something far different. In verse 10, we're finally told who he belongs to, the order, the organization, the structure in which Jesus operates as priest. He is priest of the order of Melchizedek, the first titled priest in Scripture, the king of Salem. Now, we'll close by offering a small preview into next week's class. This order of Melchizedek and the discussion that it's going to bring about is very important. This is going to explain a lot about how Jesus is priest and how he operates as priest. Unfortunately, we're not ready for that conversation, or at least the original audience is not ready for that conversation. Next week's class, the author is going to go off on a tangent. He's going to purposely interrupt himself in order to arrest the attention of his audience and really scold them, rebuke them, shame them because they're not ready to hear about Melchizedek yet. He tells them they too have fallen into the ignorance and the waywardness of the Exodus generation. In next week's class, we'll look at that rebuke when we cover Hebrews 5:11 through 6:12. All right, thank you all for your attention.